The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of Afghanistan's Kunar province. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. As the only female sniper attached to SEAL Team 6 for this mission, she knew every eye was on her, waiting to see if she could measure up to the legendary reputation of America's elite naval commandos. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces, was hiding in a remote mountain compound. The compound sat like a fortress on a hillside, surrounded by natural barriers that made it nearly impossible to approach undetected. Sarah's job was to provide overwatch from a ridge approximately 800 meters away, while the SEAL team moved in for the capture. Lieutenant Commander Jake Rodriguez, the team leader, had initially been skeptical about having a female sniper on the mission, not because he doubted women's capabilities in combat, but because this particular operation required someone who could remain perfectly still for hours in extreme conditions while maintaining absolute precision. Sarah had proven herself in Iraq, where she held the record for the longest confirmed kill shot by any Army sniper in that theater. Her reputation preceded her, but Rodriguez knew that reputation meant nothing if she couldn't deliver when it mattered most. The team had been moving through the mountainous terrain for 3 days, carefully avoiding Taliban patrols and local informants who might compromise their position. Sarah carried her custom-built rifle, a modified M24 sniper weapon system that she had personally zeroed and adjusted over countless hours on the range. The weapon was an extension of herself, and she knew every quirk and characteristic of how it performed under different conditions. As they approached the target area, the terrain became increasingly treacherous. Loose rocks and steep inclines made every step a calculated risk. Sarah moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years training in similar environments. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements deliberate and silent. The other team members, initially curious about how she would handle the physical demands of the mission, quickly realized they were working alongside a true professional. The compound came into view just as the afternoon light began to fade. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the layout clearly. The main building was a 2-story structure made of mud, brick, and stone, typical of the region's architecture. Several smaller outbuildings surrounded it, connected by low walls that created natural defensive positions. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter at irregular intervals, their weapons visible even from this distance. Rodriguez called for a halt about 2 kilometers from the target. The team established a temporary observation post behind a cluster of large boulders that provided both concealment and protection. Sarah immediately began studying the compound through her rifle scope, noting the positions of sentries, identifying potential firing lanes, and calculating distances to various points around the target area. The intelligence had been accurate about the compound's defensive capabilities, but there were details that hadn't been included in the briefing. Sarah counted at least 12 armed individuals moving around the compound, significantly more than the estimated 6 to 8 that had been reported. She also noticed that the guards were well equipped, with modern weapons, and appeared to be following professional security protocols rather than the haphazard patrol patterns typically seen with local militia groups. As night fell, the team refined their assault plan. The SEALs would approach from the north side of the compound, where the terrain provided the best concealment. Sarah would remain on the ridge, providing covering fire and eliminating any threats that might compromise the team's approach or extraction. Her position offered clear sight lines to most of the compound, but there were several blind spots where enemies could potentially take cover. The night air grew cold as they waited for the optimal time to begin the operation. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, ensuring that her rifle was properly zeroed and that her ammunition was easily accessible. She had brought specialized rounds designed for long-range precision shooting, each one carefully selected and inspected before the mission began. Rodriguez approached her position just before midnight. The compound had settled into a quieter routine, with fewer guards visible and most of the activity concentrated around the main building. Intelligence suggested that their target would be meeting with other Taliban leaders sometime after midnight, making this the perfect window for the assault. The SEAL team began their approach at exactly 12:30. Sarah watched through her scope as the 6-man team moved like shadows across the landscape. using every available piece of cover to mask their advance. Their movement was so smooth and coordinated that even with her elevated position and night vision scope, she sometimes lost sight of them completely. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan, until Sarah noticed movement in one of the guard towers that had appeared empty during their earlier observation. A figure emerged from what must have been a concealed position, raising what looked like a radio to his mouth. If he managed to alert the compound's defenders, the entire mission would be compromised, and the SEAL team would be walking into a trap. Sarah's training took over immediately. She calculated the distance, adjusted for wind speed and direction, and controlled her breathing as she had done thousands of times before. The crosshairs settled on the guard's center mass just as he began speaking into the radio. Her finger applied steady pressure to the trigger, and the rifle fired with a suppressed crack that echoed softly across the valley. The guard dropped instantly, the radio falling from his lifeless hands to shatter on the rocks below. Sarah quickly scanned the compound for any reaction to the shot, but the other guards seemed unaware that anything had happened. The SEAL team continued their approach, now just a few hundred meters from the compound's outer perimeter. What none of them knew was that this single shot would be the beginning of a firefight that would test every skill Sarah had learned during her years of training and combat experience. The Taliban commander they were hunting had prepared for exactly this type of assault, and the compound held far more surprises than anyone had anticipated. The SEAL team reached the compound's outer wall without incident, their dark forms barely visible against the night sky. Sarah maintained her overwatch position, scanning continuously for threats while keeping one eye on the team's progress. Through her night vision scope, she could see Rodriguez hand signaling to his men as they prepared to breach the perimeter. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected direction. Sarah caught movement in her peripheral vision and swung her rifle toward the eastern approach to the compound. A group of armed men was moving up the hillside, clearly attempting to flank the SEAL team's position. These weren't the guards from the compound. They were reinforcements that had somehow been alerted to the ongoing operation. Sarah's mind raced as she counted the approaching fighters. At least 8 men, possibly more, were moving in a coordinated assault formation. They carried automatic weapons and seemed to know exactly where they were going. Someone had definitely tipped them off, and now the SEAL team was about to be caught between 2 hostile forces. She immediately activated her radio to warn Rodriguez, but static filled her earpiece. The Taliban had deployed electronic jamming equipment, cutting off communication between team members at the worst possible moment. Sarah was on her own, with no way to coordinate with the assault team or call for backup support. The flanking force was now within 300 meters of the compound and closing fast. If they reached the SEAL team's position undetected, the results would be catastrophic. Sarah had to act quickly, but engaging multiple targets would immediately reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the area. Once they knew where she was shooting from, she would become the primary target for every weapon they could bring to bear on her ridge. The lead fighter in the flanking group suddenly stopped and raised his hand, signaling the others to halt. Sarah realized he had spotted something that made him suspicious. Through her scope, she could see him studying the area where the SEAL team had taken cover behind the compound wall. In seconds, he would raise the alarm and the entire operation would collapse into chaos. Sarah's first shot took the leader in the chest, dropping him silently before he could alert his men. The other fighters immediately went to ground, confused about where the shot had come from but aware that they were under attack. Sarah worked her bolt action smoothly, chambering another round while tracking her next target. The second fighter made the mistake of raising his head to scan for the sniper's position. Sarah's bullet found him before he could duck back into cover. Now the remaining fighters knew they were facing a sniper, and they began moving erratically to avoid giving her a clear shot. Some took cover behind rocks while others started a zigzag pattern up the hill, making themselves much harder targets. Meanwhile, the SEAL team had successfully breached the compound wall and was moving toward the main building. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from inside the compound as they engaged the guards in close quarters combat. The sound of gunfire would travel for miles in the thin mountain air, potentially alerting every Taliban fighter in the region to their presence. 3 of the flanking fighters had taken cover behind a large boulder about 200 meters from the compound. They were trying to work their way around to a position where they could attack the SEAL team from behind. Sarah knew she had to eliminate them before they could complete their movement. But the angle was difficult and they were using cover effectively. She waited patiently, controlling her breathing and keeping her scope trained on the edge of the boulder where she expected them to appear. Military training had taught her that most people, even experienced fighters, eventually made predictable movements when under stress. After several minutes, one of the fighters grew impatient and exposed too much of his shoulder while trying to get a better view of the compound. Sarah's shot shattered his shoulder blade and spun him around before he collapsed behind the rock. His scream of pain echoed across the hillside, unnerving his companions and probably alerting other enemy forces to the ongoing battle. The other two fighters behind the boulder began firing wildly in Sarah's general direction, but their shots fell well short of her position. The compound had erupted in full-scale combat now. Sarah could see the SEAL team moving from building to building, clearing rooms and pursuing their target. Tracer rounds streaked across the courtyard as Taliban fighters tried to establish defensive positions. Several small explosions indicated that the SEALs were using breaching charges to access secured areas of the main building. More fighters were appearing from concealed positions around the compound that hadn't been visible during the initial reconnaissance. The intelligence estimates had been drastically wrong about the number of defenders. Instead of 6 to 8 lightly armed guards, there appeared to be at least 20 well-equipped fighters defending the position. Sarah realized this had been a carefully planned trap, designed to lure American Special Forces into a kill zone. A new group of enemy fighters emerged from a hidden bunker on the south side of the compound. They were carrying what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, clearly intending to use it against the SEAL team's position. Sarah swung her rifle toward this new threat, knowing that a direct hit from an RPG could kill or seriously wound multiple team members. The A fighter carrying the RPG was moving toward a position that would give him a clear shot at the building. Where most of the SEAL team was concentrated, Sarah tracked him through her scope, waiting for a moment when he would stop long enough to provide a stable target. The range was just over 600 meters, well within her capabilities but requiring perfect timing and accuracy. The RPG gunner stopped behind a low wall and began setting up his weapon. Sarah could see him adjusting the sight and preparing to fire. This was her only chance to stop him before he could launch his attack. She controlled her breathing, settled the crosshairs on his center mass, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck him in the upper chest just as he was raising the RPG to his shoulder. The weapon fell from his hands and clattered to the ground as he collapsed. However, another fighter immediately moved to retrieve the fallen weapon. Determined to complete the attack against the American forces, Sarah was already working her bolt action, chambering another round while tracking the second RPG gunner. Time was running out for the SEAL team, and she could see more enemy reinforcements arriving from multiple directions. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and she was the only thing standing between her teammates and complete disaster. The second RPG gunner never got the chance to fire. Sarah's bullet caught him in the head just as he was aiming the weapon toward the main building. The rocket-propelled grenade fell harmlessly to the ground, but Sarah knew there would be more threats emerging soon. The Taliban had clearly prepared for this type of assault and had positioned weapons and fighters throughout the area. Enemy fire was now coming from multiple directions, creating a deadly crossfire that threatened to pin down the SEAL team inside the compound. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions, and more fighters were arriving every few minutes. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she realized that the original mission to capture the Taliban commander had become a fight for survival. Through her scope, Sarah watched as Rodriguez and his team fought their way through the main building, room by room. They moved with the precision and coordination that made Navy SEALs legendary, but they were clearly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Every few seconds, one of them would appear at a window or doorway, fire several aimed shots, then disappear back into cover before return fire could find them. A group of Taliban fighters had taken position in one of the outbuildings and were directing concentrated fire toward the main building where the SEALs were trapped. Their position gave them a clear view of the courtyard and any escape routes the Americans might try to use. Sarah knew she had to eliminate this threat before the SEALs attempted to extract from the compound. The range to the outbuilding was approximately 700 meters, and the targets were partially concealed behind stone walls and wooden shutters. Sarah would have to wait for each fighter to expose himself long enough to get a clear shot. This type of precision shooting required infinite patience and perfect timing, especially when her teammates' lives depended on every bullet. The first fighter made the mistake of leaning too far out of a window while trying to get a better angle on the SEAL team. Sarah's shot took him cleanly, and he tumbled backward out of sight. The other fighters in the building immediately became more cautious, but their caution would work against them. If they couldn't maintain effective fire on the main building, the SEALs would have a chance to break contact and begin their extraction. More enemy reinforcements were streaming up the mountain paths from the valley below. Sarah could see their flashlights and hear their voices echoing off the rocky terrain. The Taliban commander had obviously called for every available fighter in the region, and they were responding in overwhelming numbers. Soon the Americans would be facing odds of more than 10-1. Sarah shifted her position slightly to get a better view of the approaching reinforcements. Through her night vision scope, she could count at least 15 fighters moving in a loose formation up the main trail. They were heavily armed and appeared to be moving with military precision rather than the chaotic advance she might have expected. From local militia, the lead elements of this reinforcement group were now close enough to threaten the SEAL team's planned extraction route. Rodriguez and his men would have to fight their way through this force to reach the rally point where they had planned to regroup before beginning their journey back to the forward operating base. Sarah realized she would have to thin out these reinforcements before they could establish blocking positions. Her next target was a fighter carrying what appeared to be a light machine gun. This weapon could lay down devastating suppressive fire that would make movement impossible for the SEAL team. Sarah tracked him through her scope as he moved up the trail, waiting for him to stop long enough to provide a stable shot opportunity. The machine gunner paused behind a large rock to catch his breath and study the terrain ahead. This was exactly the opportunity Sarah had been waiting for. Her shot struck him in the torso and he collapsed behind the rock, his weapon clattering down the hillside. The other fighters immediately scattered, diving for cover and shouting warnings to each other. Now they knew there was a sniper somewhere on the ridgeline, and they began scanning the area with their weapons raised. Sarah had to remain perfectly still while they searched for her position. Any movement or reflection from her scope could give away her location and bring concentrated fire down on her position. The fighters began moving more cautiously, using every available piece of cover, and coordinating their movements to avoid giving the sniper clear shots. Sarah realized that these were experienced fighters who understood battlefield tactics. This wasn't going to be the easy engagement that the intelligence briefing had suggested. Inside the compound, the SEAL team had apparently reached their target. Sarah could see an increase in activity around the main building, with fighters moving toward that location from all directions. If the Americans had captured or killed the Taliban commander, they would need to extract immediately before enemy forces could surround them completely. Rodriguez suddenly appeared at a second-story window of the main building, visible for just a moment as he surveyed the courtyard below. Sarah could see him making hand signals to his team members, apparently coordinating their next move. They were preparing to break contact and begin their extraction. But enemy forces were converging on their position from multiple directions. A new group of fighters emerged from the eastern approach, moving to cut off the SEAL team's primary escape route. These weren't part of the original reinforcements Sarah had been engaging. They were a separate force that had approached from a different direction. The Americans were being systematically surrounded by an enemy that had planned for exactly this type of scenario. Sarah swung her rifle toward this new threat, quickly calculating ranges and wind conditions. The eastern group was moving through an area with limited cover, which would make them vulnerable to accurate sniper fire. However, they were also moving quickly and would soon reach positions, and where they could effectively engage the SEAL team. The lead fighter in the eastern group was carrying a radio and appeared to be coordinating the movements of the other fighters. Taking him out might disrupt their coordination and buy the SEAL team precious time to complete their extraction. Sarah tracked him through her scope, waiting for him to stop moving long enough to ensure a clean shot. He paused behind a low wall to speak into his radio, probably updating his commanders on the American positions and requesting additional support. Sarah's bullet caught him in the upper chest, spinning him around before he fell behind the wall. The radio flew from his hands and shattered against the rocks, hopefully disrupting communications between the various enemy groups. The other fighters in the eastern group immediately went to ground, but they were now leaderless and confused about their next move. Some began firing in Sarah's general direction, But their shots were wildly inaccurate and fell well short of her position. Without proper coordination, they would be much less effective at blocking the SEAL team's escape route. The SEAL team burst from the main building in a coordinated rush, moving in a tight formation toward their planned extraction route. Sarah could see Rodriguez leading the group, with 2 of his men providing rear security while the others carried what appeared to be a wounded teammate. The mission had clearly taken casualties, making their escape even more critical. Enemy fighters immediately opened fire from multiple positions as soon as the Americans appeared in the open courtyard. Bullets sparked off the stone walls and kicked up dust clouds around the running SEALs. Sarah knew she had to provide covering fire to give them any chance of reaching safety, but engaging multiple targets would definitely reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the area. A Taliban fighter emerged from behind a stone wall directly in the SEAL team's path, raising an AK-47 to his shoulder. Sarah's shot dropped him before he could fire, but another fighter immediately took his place. Sarah worked her bolt action quickly, chambering another round while tracking this new threat. Her second shot caught him center mass and he tumbled backward into the courtyard. More fighters were appearing from concealed positions throughout the compound, like hornets emerging from a disturbed nest. Sarah realized that the Taliban had prepared fighting positions that hadn't been visible during the initial reconnaissance. Hidden bunkers, concealed weapons caches, and camouflaged sniper nests had been strategically placed to create an elaborate kill zone. The SEAL team reached the compound wall and began climbing over, but enemy fire was intensifying from all directions. Sarah could see tracer rounds streaking across the night sky, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the surrounding mountains. Every few seconds, another muzzle flash would appear from a new position, indicating just how many fighters were now engaging the Americans. A sniper in one of the compound towers had the SEAL team in his sights as they climbed the wall. Sarah could see the distinctive profile of a rifle barrel protruding from a window opening, tracking the movement of the escaping Americans. This was exactly the type of precise threat that her long-range capabilities were designed to counter. The enemy sniper was approximately 900 meters away, well within Sarah's effective range but requiring absolute precision to ensure a clean kill. She controlled her breathing, settled the crosshairs on the barely visible target, and slowly squeezed the trigger. Through her scope, she saw the enemy sniper's head snap back as her bullet found its mark. His rifle tumbled from the window and crashed to the courtyard below. Rodriguez and his team were now moving across open ground toward their rally point, but enemy reinforcements were closing in from 3 different directions. The fighters Sarah had been engaging earlier had regrouped and were now moving to intercept the SEAL team's escape route. Without her continued intervention, the Americans would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Sarah shifted her position to get a better angle on the approaching reinforcements. The movement was risky because it might expose her to counter sniper fire, but the SEAL team needed every advantage she could provide. As she settled into her new firing position, she noticed movement on a distant ridgeline that sent a chill down her spine. Another sniper was setting up on a hillside approximately 1,200 meters away, probably trying to locate her position and eliminate the threat she posed to the Taliban forces. Sarah could see the glint of a rifle scope catching starlight as the enemy marksman scanned the area where her muzzle flashes had been visible. This was now a deadly game of cat and mouse between 2 highly trained snipers. The enemy sniper fired first, his bullet cracking past Sarah's position and striking the rocks behind her. Stone fragments peppered her back, but she remained focused on her own targets. She couldn't engage in a sniper duel while the SEAL team was still in immediate danger from the approaching fighters. Her priorities had to remain with providing covering fire for the extraction. A group of Taliban fighters had reached a position where they could enfilade the SEAL team's movement route. Sarah could see them setting up a machine gun that would sweep the entire area with devastating fire. The Americans would be caught in the open with no cover, making them easy targets for the crew-served weapon. Sarah's shot took the machine gunner in the head, just as he was settling behind his weapon. The assistant gunner immediately moved to take over, but Sarah's follow-up shot dropped him as well before he could bring the weapon into action. The other fighters in the group scattered, leaving the machine gun abandoned and useless. The SEAL team had covered about half the distance to their rally point, but they were slowing down due to the wounded team member they were carrying. Sarah could see that one man was supporting most of another's weight, making both of them vulnerable targets. Every step was a struggle, and enemy forces were closing the gap with each passing minute. More muzzle flashes erupted from positions around the compound as additional Taliban fighters joined the engagement. Sarah estimated that she was now facing at least 30 enemy combatants, all concentrated in a relatively small area, and all focused on preventing the American team from escaping. The odds were becoming increasingly desperate. The enemy sniper fired again, this time much closer to Sarah's position. She could feel the shock wave from the bullet as it passed just inches from her head. He was getting her range and would probably connect with his next shot if she didn't change position immediately. But moving now would leave the SEAL team without covering fire at the most critical moment of their extraction. Sarah made the decision to maintain her position and continue engaging targets that threatened the SEAL team, even though it meant exposing herself to the enemy sniper. Her teammates' lives were more important than her own safety, and abandoning her overwatch position now would probably doom them all to capture or death. A new group of fighters appeared on the SEAL team's left flank, moving to cut off their escape route. These appeared to be fresh reinforcements who had just arrived from the valley below, and they were moving with purpose and coordination. Sarah swung her rifle toward this new threat, knowing that she had perhaps seconds to disrupt their movement before they could establish blocking positions. Her first shot dropped the lead fighter, causing the others to dive for cover and disrupting their coordinated advance. Sarah worked her bolt action and acquired another target, a fighter who was trying to maneuver around a large boulder to get a better position. Her second shot caught him as he exposed himself, spinning him around before he collapsed out of sight. The enemy sniper fired again, and this time his bullet struck the rock directly in front of Sarah's position, showering her with stone fragments and dust. He had her exact location now, and was probably adjusting his aim for a killing shot. Sarah knew she had perhaps one more opportunity to engage targets before she would have to abandon her position or risk being eliminated. Sarah made a split-second decision that would determine whether she lived or died in the next few moments. Instead of abandoning her position to avoid the enemy sniper, she swung her rifle toward his location and prepared for the most difficult shot of her military career. At 1,200 meters in darkness while under direct fire, she would have one chance to eliminate the threat before he could kill her. Through her scope, she could barely make out the enemy sniper's position on the distant ridgeline. He was well concealed behind natural rock formations, with only the occasional glint of his scope visible as he tracked her movements. Sarah had to time her shot perfectly, waiting for the moment when he would be focused on his own firing sequence and less likely to detect her movement. The SEAL team was now within 200 meters of their rally point, but enemy fighters were converging on that location from multiple directions. Sarah could see at least a dozen Taliban moving through the rocky terrain, trying to reach the rally point before the Americans could establish a defensive perimeter. If they succeeded, the extraction would become a siege with the SEALs surrounded and outnumbered. Sarah forced herself to ignore the approaching enemy sniper and focus on the immediate threats to her teammates. A group of 3 fighters had reached a position where they could observe the rally point and were preparing to set up an ambush. She tracked the lead fighter through her scope, waiting for a clear shot opportunity while maintaining awareness of the sniper threat on the distant ridge. Her shot dropped the lead fighter, just as he was raising his rifle to sight in on the approaching SEAL team. The other 2 fighters immediately went to ground, but Sarah had already shifted her aim to the second target. Her follow-up shot caught him as he tried to crawl behind a boulder, eliminating another threat to the extraction. The enemy sniper fired again, and Sarah felt the bullet pass so close to her head that she could feel the heat from its passage. Rock fragments from the impact stung her face, and she knew that his next shot would almost certainly be fatal if she remained in this position. But the SEAL team was still in the open and desperately needed her covering fire. Rodriguez and his men reached the rally point and immediately began establishing a defensive perimeter. Sarah could see them positioning themselves behind available cover while continuing to carry their wounded teammate. They were now in a slightly better tactical position, but enemy forces were still closing in from all directions. A Taliban fighter with an RPG had worked his way to within 300 meters of the rally point and was preparing to fire on the concentrated SEAL team. Sarah knew that a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade could kill or wound multiple team members and end any hope of a successful extraction. This target took absolute priority over everything else, including her own survival. Sarah swung her rifle toward the RPG gunner, quickly calculating the range and wind conditions. The target was moving, trying to get into position for his shot while avoiding detection. Sarah had to lead her target perfectly, timing her shot to intercept him at exactly the right moment. The RPG gunner stopped behind a low wall and raised his weapon to his shoulder, aiming directly at the SEAL team's position. Sarah's crosshairs settled on his center mass just as he was preparing to fire. Her bullet struck him in the chest, and the RPG tumbled from his hands to explode harmlessly against the rock several meters away. The explosion lit up the night sky and revealed the positions of several other Taliban fighters who had been using the darkness for concealment. Sarah immediately began engaging these newly visible targets, working her bolt action rapidly while tracking multiple threats. Her training and muscle memory took over completely, allowing her to fire and reload with mechanical precision. The enemy sniper had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the RPG explosion would backlight Sarah's position and make her clearly visible against the rocky background. His shot struck the rock just inches from her head, and she knew that his next round would find its mark unless she acted immediately. Sarah rolled to her left, abandoning her carefully prepared firing position and moving to a new location about 10 meters away. The movement would cost her precious seconds while she re-established her sight picture and range estimates. But staying in the original position would have meant certain death. As she settled into her new position, Sarah could see the SEAL team beginning to move again, apparently having determined that the rally point was too exposed to hold for long. They were moving in bounds, with half the team providing covering fire while the others advanced to new positions. Their movement was coordinated and professional, but they were clearly running low on ammunition. More Taliban reinforcements were arriving every few minutes, and Sarah estimated that the Americans were now facing odds of at least 20-1. The enemy forces were beginning to coordinate their movements more effectively, suggesting that a senior commander had arrived to take control of the tactical situation. A new threat emerged from an unexpected direction as a group of fighters approached the SEAL team's position from the north. These appeared to be a fresh unit that had been moving through the mountains and had just arrived at the battle area. They were well equipped and moving with military precision, suggesting they might be foreign fighters or specially trained Taliban units. Sarah engaged the lead elements of this new group, dropping 2 fighters with rapid precision shots before they could establish firing positions. However, the others immediately dispersed and began using advanced small unit tactics to close with the SEAL team's position. These were clearly experienced fighters who understood how to operate under sniper fire. The enemy sniper fired again from his distant position, and this time his bullet struck the rocks directly behind Sarah's new firing position. He had tracked her movement and was adjusting his aim accordingly. Sarah realized that she was running out of options and would soon have to choose between abandoning her Overwatch mission or facing almost certain death. The SEAL team had reached another defensive position about 400 meters from the original rally point, but they were being pressed from all sides by overwhelming enemy forces. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from dozens of weapons as Taliban fighters closed in from every direction. The Americans were fighting desperately, but their ammunition situation was becoming critical. Rodriguez suddenly appeared from behind cover and began signaling in Sarah's direction. Even at this distance, she could see that he was making the hand signal for immediate extraction, indicating that the team could no longer maintain their position and needed to break contact immediately. But enemy forces were now positioned to block every possible escape route from the area. Sarah understood that the time for measured precision shooting had passed. The SEAL team needed massive suppressive fire to break contact with the overwhelming enemy forces, and she was the only one in position to provide it. She abandoned her careful shooting techniques and began engaging targets as rapidly as possible, working her bolt action with mechanical efficiency while sweeping across the battlefield. Her first priority was clearing the escape route that Rodriguez had indicated with his hand signals. A cluster of Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in a narrow valley that represented the team's only viable path to safety. Sarah began systematically eliminating these fighters, dropping one after another with rapid, accurate fire that sent the survivors scrambling for better cover. The enemy sniper fired again, and his bullet struck so close to Sarah's position that rock fragments cut her cheek. She could taste blood in her mouth, but she continued engaging targets without pause. The SEAL team's survival depended entirely on her ability to suppress enemy fire long enough for them to reach safety, and personal considerations had become irrelevant. Taliban fighters were now returning fire in her direction from multiple positions. Having finally determined her general location through muzzle flash observation and the enemy sniper's guidance, bullets began striking the rocks around her position with increasing frequency, creating a deadly storm of flying stone fragments and ricochets. Sarah shifted position again, moving to a location that offered better cover, while still maintaining sight lines to the critical areas of the battlefield. The movement cost her valuable seconds, but staying in the previous position would have been suicide. As she settled behind a large boulder, she could see the SEAL team beginning their break for the escape route. Rodriguez was leading his men in a fighting withdrawal, moving by bounds while maintaining disciplined fire on the pursuing Taliban forces. They were carrying their wounded teammate between two men, which slowed their movement significantly but demonstrated the SEAL ethos of never leaving anyone behind. Every meter of their retreat was being contested by enemy fighters who seemed determined to prevent any American from escaping alive. A Taliban commander had apparently taken control of the pursuit, because Sarah could see the enemy fighters beginning to move with better coordination and tactical discipline. Instead of the chaotic advance she had been exploiting earlier, they were now using proper fire and movement techniques that made them much more dangerous opponents. Sarah engaged a group of fighters who were trying to establish a blocking position in the narrow valley ahead of the SEAL team. Her rapid fire forced them to abandon their positions, but she knew more would take their place within minutes. The Taliban had virtually unlimited reinforcements arriving from throughout the region. While the Americans were down to their last few magazines of ammunition, the enemy sniper had finally gotten her exact range. His next shot shattered the rock just above Sarah's head, sending a shower of stone fragments down on her position. She could feel warm blood running down her face from multiple cuts, but her vision remained clear and her hands steady. Years of training had prepared her for exactly this type of extreme stress situation. Rodriguez and his team were now halfway through the valley, but their progress was slowing as enemy fire intensified from both flanks. Sarah could see Taliban fighters moving to high ground positions where they could direct plunging fire down into the narrow passage. If those positions weren't neutralized immediately, the SEAL team would be caught in a devastating crossfire. Sarah began engaging the fighters on the high ground, working methodically from left to right across the ridgeline. Each shot had to count because she was down to her last magazine of ammunition, and there would be no opportunity to resupply. Her first target dropped cleanly, tumbling down the rocky slope in a cloud of dust and loose stones. The second fighter on the ridge tried to take cover behind a boulder, but he exposed too much of his torso while attempting to return fire. Sarah's bullet caught him center mass and he collapsed behind his cover. The remaining fighters on the high ground became much more cautious, giving the SEAL team a brief respite from the deadly plunging fire. Enemy reinforcements were streaming into the valley from behind the SEAL team's position, threatening to cut off their escape route completely. Sarah counted at least 20 fresh fighters moving in formation, armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. They were moving fast and would reach the valley entrance within minutes. Sarah made the hardest decision of her military career. She abandoned her overwatch position and began moving down the hillside toward the valley, carrying her rifle and remaining ammunition. She could provide more effective close-range support by positioning herself near the SEAL team rather than maintaining distant overwatch. It was a desperate gamble, but the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond conventional sniper employment. The enemy sniper immediately detected her movement and began firing rapidly at her running form. Bullets cracked past her head and struck the rocks around her feet as she bounded down the steep slope, using every available piece of cover to mask her approach. One round passed so close that it tore through the fabric of her sleeve without touching skin. As Sarah reached the valley floor, she could see the SEAL team just 50 meters ahead, still fighting their way through the narrow passage while carrying their wounded teammate. Rodriguez spotted her approach and signaled for her to take position on the left flank, where enemy fighters were massing for another assault. Sarah immediately engaged the nearest threats, dropping 2 Taliban fighters who were preparing to fire RPGs at the concentrated SEAL team. Her close-range shooting was devastatingly accurate, and the remaining enemies scattered to avoid her deadly fire. For the first time in hours, the Americans had a brief moment of tactical advantage. The SEAL team used this opportunity to increase their pace, with Sarah providing covering fire from their left flank, while they moved through the most dangerous section of the valley. Her presence allowed them to concentrate their own fire on threats from other directions, creating a small bubble of relative safety in the midst of overwhelming enemy forces. Rodriguez appeared beside Sarah's position, breathing heavily but still moving with professional efficiency. He had left his team in a defensive position, while he moved to coordinate directly with their sniper support. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and Sarah could see that he had taken at least one bullet through his equipment vest. "We've got extraction coming in 20 minutes, Rodriguez shouted over the sound of gunfire. "Helicopter landing zone is 2 clicks north of here. Can you keep them off us that long?" Sarah checked her ammunition and realized she had fewer than 10 rounds remaining. 20 minutes of sustained combat would require at least 100 rounds, probably more given the number of enemy fighters in the area. But she looked Rodriguez in the eye and nodded without hesitation. "Roger that, boss. Let's get our people home." The SEAL team resumed their movement with Sarah now integrated into their formation, providing precision fire while they advanced toward the extraction point. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder as more Taliban reinforcements joined the chase. The race to the landing zone would determine whether any of them lived to see another day. As they cleared the valley and began climbing toward the extraction point, Sarah could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching through the mountain peaks. The sound meant salvation for the SEAL team, but it also meant that the next 20 minutes would be the most intense combat any of them had ever experienced. The Taliban would throw everything they had at preventing the Americans from reaching that helicopter. Sarah chambered her last round and prepared for the final phase of a battle that had already become legendary among those who witnessed it. A female army sniper had single-handedly held off an entire Taliban force, saving the lives of America's most elite warriors through pure skill and unbreakable determination. The story would be told in military circles for generations, inspiring future warriors to push beyond the limits of what seemed humanly possible.